So here we are at hurdle 5, which is the multifaceted self. Now, this is a big one, but I hope you've been keeping up with the series, because in the first one, we looked at the idea of the medical model, how much medical thinking has influenced the way you think about yourself. Secondly, we looked at the idea of man's wisdom versus the biblical view, which is very much the idea of how science is coming back into line with the Bible. In the third hurdle, we looked at the idea of the conflicted self. In other words, going from conflicted self to harmonized self, which is again moving towards that biblical view. And in the hurdle 4, we looked at the idea of the true nature of sin, or what sin really is, and how we should be looking at it in order to grow and make progress. Well, here we are now at hurdle 5, which is the multifaceted self, which is taking all of those 4 ideas into account and then moving on to the idea that if you're multifaceted, then this is normal. In other words, what does it mean to be multifaceted? What we're talking about? Well, have you ever said to yourself, I'm in 2 minds about that? Or I just saw red, or I don't know what came over me. Now, what about voices? What about a voice in your head saying to do something maybe you don't want to do, or maybe you think you shouldn't be doing? Well, that's something that we all have. And what neuroscience has shown us is that this is normal. Now, for years, decades, maybe even hundreds of years, medical science and all the ideas of those hurdles we've been looking at, they've been convincing you that this is a mental illness or there's something wrong with you. We don't really want to admit to this kind of thing. Well, neuroscience now has shown that actually this is perfectly normal, and this is the human condition. And guess what? Well, the Bible's been saying this all along. So there's basically 2 things I want to say about this. Firstly, that neuroscience has shown us that this is normal. That through therapeutic approaches like internal family systems, IFS, that we see that this is normal practice and can be very helpful when you understand it. And secondly, we see amazingly that the Bible's been saying this all along. This is what the Bible says is your condition. This is how the Bible says you should be understanding yourself. So there are many places we could go in the Bible to show you this, but let's go to the first and the most basic. It's in Genesis 1 and verse 26, and I'm reading from the NIV once again. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." When you say, I'm one thing, or I'm only one thing, or it's just me, or you think about things that we say like, oh, I lost it, right? Now, when you start to understand this from a biblical perspective, then you start to think very differently about this. Let me give you another example here. So here we are now in Romans 7, and it's verse 20. Again, many examples in Romans, but here's a very straightforward one. Romans 7 verse 20. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me that does it. So what is he saying here? He's saying that I am more than one thing. That made in God's image, I am like God, multifaceted. I have more than one part of me. And so when you start to see this idea, you start to work from a very different perspective than when you say, it's just me, right? So you should start to see a very large difference now between what the medical idea or the traditional or man's wisdom, whatever you want to call it, what that says about you, which is that you're this crazy person that sometimes does this and sometimes does that, and sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down, sometimes you're this, sometimes you're that. The Bible says that if you're not doing what you want to do, then that's not you. That's not you that's doing it. Why? Because you, on the contrary, you are very, very consistent. So instead of being this inconsistent, crazy self, what we're saying is that ask yourself this question: why would you do something that you don't want to do? Why would you? Why would you ever do something that you've made up your mind not to do? Why would you do something that you have said to yourself and others, I'm never doing that again? Well, in order to do those things, you'd have to be some kind of crazy person or some kind of inconsistent person. And that's what man's wisdom has led us to believe. But what if the Bible is true? And what if you do something you've said you don't want to do, that's not you? Now, before you start thinking, oh, you know, that's making me out to be even crazier. No, what it's saying is you're swapping one inconsistent self for several consistent selves. And you'll understand this better and better as we go along. But the first thing I want to say is that this is not an excuse for bad behavior. This is not a way of attempting to get you out from under or avoid responsibility. The Bible never does that. So don't think for a minute that we're just trying to give you a softer, easier way out here. What we're doing is we're saying that in a rather basic and fundamental way, we have over the years started to misunderstand our nature. Your nature is to be multifaceted. Now, as I say, you're going to understand this more and more as we get over further hurdles. But for now, I want you to understand that you have both a brain and a mind. And by that, the way I want you to think of it simply is this, is that you have a front room and a back room. And that they both work independently, they both work autonomously, and they often go in different directions. So whilst your brain is going one way, your mind is going the other. And sometimes your brain takes over. So let me give you an example now using a very simple graphic about how I want you to think about this. So in a very simplified model, I want you to first picture a room. Now this is the room where you live. This is your mind. This is where all the thoughts and pictures happen. And it's the internalizing of what in the Bible is known as the upper room. So we're doing the same thing as we're doing with discipling. We're taking things from the external world and we are reproducing them internally. So you have your mind, your upper room. Now in that room, you are present. You are observing. And when we talk about the observer position, this is what we're talking about. And I want you to think of this as your soul. This is your true self. And this is sometimes called the spirit of man in the Bible. Now, in the room, you have a television. Or rather, it could be some form of media. If you use a computer or you use your phone a lot, then you could use that instead. Essentially, it's a place where you can view certain media. And I want you to think of this as your consciousness or your awareness. This is where the words and pictures form in the room. Now, you have choices. Generally, you have choices which channel to watch, which media to watch. And the choices boil down to two things. You can watch the flesh channel or you can watch the spirit channel. And this is where we are conscious and trying our best and so on, and make choices and try to do what we want to do. But there is one more complication to this, and that is that sometimes, just like on your whatever device you use for your media, sometimes messages come up that you didn't intend. Sometimes somebody wants to befriend you or send you a video, or there's a link or a connection you didn't mean to have. So this is intrusive. And this is what can happen with the flesh channel, particularly if it feels you to be threatened. So for now, just for the moment, I want you to understand this multifacetedness as simply a front room and a back room. Simply your mind and your brain. Just split it into two for now. We will learn more about it as we go. But the idea is that these two things are separate, they're autonomous, and they go in different directions. Now, there's lots of places I could take you to understand this, because the Bible is not vague about this at all. But here's a good example from Galatians. I'm going to read chapter 5, verse 17. For the sinful nature desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the sinful nature. They are in conflict with each other, so that you do not do what you want. Now, if you go back to something like the King James, that will not say that they're in conflict, it will say that they're in opposition to one another. And that is a more measured language. Or if you're going to read a more modern Bible, you'll read something like, that there's a constant battle raging between them, which is, fighting talk. But the main idea I want you to get here is more in line with that old version, which is to say that they are simply two things going in different directions. And the key here is to understand that they're both doing their best. Now, I know that's probably not what you've been taught, so I want you to think about it. And as always, I want you to go to the Bible for the evidence. You could look at something like Romans 8, verse 7, which says that the flesh cannot please God. It simply cannot do so. In other words, it's not possible for it to do so. It's not good trying harder or, trying to persuade it in some way. It simply can't do so. Now, I give the example of trying to explain God to a cow. You're wasting your time. It doesn't have the capacity to understand God. In fact, I would go as far as to say that as far as your brain / flesh is concerned, you are God. Your bodily self is the nearest thing your flesh can understand to God. And so therefore it puts your safety and your security first. So look, I know this is probably not what you've been taught up to now, and it's quite different. I want you to use the Bible as the evidence, nothing else. And so this is an example I give sometimes, which might make it click for you. I want you to picture in the next room, you're overhearing an argument, okay? And it's there's two positions being taken in this argument. One is that they're both football fans, and one is saying, United's the best, and the other one is saying City's the best, or, there's this argument going on. Now, if you were to open the door and put your head through the door there and have a look at what's going on, and you saw two people, one with, City colours on and one with United colours on, it would make perfect sense to you. But if you saw just one person in the room, starts to look a little bit crazy now, doesn't it, right? Well, that's the difference we're talking about. The moment that you unblend, which is the technical term for it, I want you to unblend your thinking and know where it comes. Is it coming from the front room? Is it coming from the back room? That's the key question. So once you do that and you say, well, there's two sides to this argument, right? Which is perfectly in keeping with the way we speak. When we say I'm in two minds about that, well, you haven't got two minds. You've only got one. The other one is your brain. Right? So once you start to unblend this, then some of your crazy behavior, some of your inconsistent nature starts to make perfect sense. Now, that's what we want to take forwards. So the first thing I want to say here is thank you for taking the time to watch this and to listen to it. And because it's such a huge hurdle of the 7 that we're looking at, I do want to emphasize here now the takeaway. What is it that I want you to take from this session here? Well, the first point, and probably the most important, is that you are multifaceted. In other words, you're not just one thing. According to Genesis 1:26, you are made in God's image, which is plural. And not only are you multifaceted, but that this is normal. That there's nothing unusual about that. It's not a mental illness. You're not a crazy person because you are sometimes acting inconsistently. And that is the first and biggest takeaway here. The second point is that therapeutic approaches such as internal family systems, IFS, as informed by neuroscience, are using this idea to great effect. And I have to say that personally, as a psychotherapist, since I started using this approach, the results are literally mind-blowing. Because we're coming into line with reality, with truth, what the Bible's been talking about. And that is the third point, which is that the Bible has been saying this all along. And I've given you chapter and verse about that. You can also study it for yourself. But the idea that when we talk about neuroscience and when we talk about therapeutic approaches, believe me, I'm only talking about them in as much as they are lining up with the Bible. And that is what science is starting to do. Science is not the enemy of religion. And finally, fourth point is that once you get over this particular hurdle, you will benefit hugely. I really want you to get hold of this idea. I know you don't understand everything at this point, and we are going to go over more of it. But even now, I want you to encourage yourself to understand that this is going to benefit you hugely. A lot of the ways that you may have failed in the past, or you may have been disappointed, a lot of the ways in which you have thought badly of yourself or thought you're mad, bad or sad, the idea that there's something wrong with you, you need fixing. This biblical perspective, this absolute truth is really helping to expose the real truth about you. What is your true human nature? And once you get this, a lot of your efforts to make progress and to develop yourself personally and spiritually are going to really be accelerated in ways that you can barely imagine possible if you've been looking at things from a more natural or more, shall we say, from man's wisdom's perspective. So, again, I want to say thank you for taking the time with this. If you want to support this ministry, because I always want to make this information freely available to you, you can support it further if you go to my Patreon link and become a supporter of the channel. I will put a link down below in the notes, so you'll be able to see a link there to go to my Patreon. If you choose to do that, whatever you choose to do, I look forward to seeing you on Hurdle 6.